So to start off with, what is your name? And you can go by your YouTube name. And how long, or what is your team?
My name on the internet is Pigskin Pete. That's how people know me, and which is obviously not my government name. And I've been, I'm a Clemson fan. Obviously, you can see behind me.
Awesome. So, how long have you been a Clemson fan for?
As long as I can remember. Well, at least since 1984 or five, and I was born in 1980, so very young.
All right, fantastic. So, what exactly is your story behind that? What made you a fan of Clemson specifically?
Well, when you grow up in this state, yeah, I was born in this state. I live in the Charleston area. Uh, it doesn't take long before you're either indoctrinated or swayed one way or another to become either a Clemson or a South Carolina fan. Almost everybody that I knew growing up had a sibling or an uncle or an aunt or maybe their parents that went to one of those two schools if they were from this state. My sister, who is 14 years, my oldest sister, who's 14 years older than me, was the first one in our family to go to Clemson, and that was in the mid 80s. So I was very young. I was 4 or 5 years old. And she was a rally cat, which is basically a dancer. They had the cheerleaders and they had the dance team. You know, the ones that dance at the football and basketball games and whatnot. And so she brought me up there one weekend and took me to my first Clemson game. That was in 1986. I think that might have been her. She might have been a sophomore or a junior at that time. And I was just a very, very young. And she took me to my first Clemson game in Death Valley. It was against Duke. I remember that. And Clemson did win. I remember that. But I remember walking into that stadium as a very young boy and just by being hooked from the start. So that's how I became a Clemson fan. I inherited it. And then, you know, to go on in my life, my older brother also went to Clemson. My wife went to Clemson, which we were high school sweethearts. So she went off to Clemson. I stayed here in Charleston. But of course, I was traveling back and forth from here to Clemson for 4 years while she was there. And so I feel like I went there, but I just didn't go to class there. I spent so much time there. So it's a family thing.
Well, that's a fantastic story behind that. So my next question is, well, what is you've attended Clemson football games, right? So you at least attended one.
Oh, dozens.
Awesome. So out of all the ones that you've attended, which would you say is the best Clemson game that you've attended?
There's at least two or three that I could put on this list, but I'm going to have to say 2015 against Notre Dame during a hurricane, and a literal hurricane. Now, it wasn't hurricane force winds in Clemson because they're further inland, but there was a hurricane in the state of South Carolina, and we drove 3.5 hours from where I live to Clemson. We were literally the only people on the road. It wasn't advisable, but that was probably the one of the best sporting events I've ever been to. Not just Clemson games. It was a top 10 matchup at the time. I can't remember the last time Notre Dame came to Clemson before that year. And it was an epic game that came down to the end. And of course, Clemson went on to make a national championship run, ended up losing to Alabama in the national title. But I would say the Notre Dame game in 2015, and an honorable mention for second is the Peach Bowl against LSU. And I think it was 2012. It was on New Year's Eve. Of course, if you've never played against LSU or been to a game where your team is playing against LSU, I would highly advise it. They are a fan base unlike any other. And when you throw in New Year's Eve on top of that, they're even crazier than normal. So that was an honorable mention there.
Absolutely. Well, those are two fantastic things you put there. And I've been to an LSU game before, so I absolutely know what you're talking about. So my next question to you is, so obviously you're a Clemson fan. But is there any team outside of Clemson that you aren't necessarily a fan of, but have a mutual respect for? Is there any other team like that?
Yeah, Notre Dame. I know they're one of the most hated brands and teams in football because of their independence and whatnot. But going back to what we were talking about earlier about my family history with Clemson growing up, which is why I'm a Clemson guy, same can be sort of said for Notre Dame. Now, I'm not a Notre Dame fan, never was, but I have family ties. My grandfather graduated from Notre Dame. My uncle graduated from Notre Dame. I'm named after those guys. And I grew up Irish Catholic in an Irish Catholic household in the South. My parents were from the North, but I grew up, they moved down here for military reasons, and this is where I was born. So I do have some sort of like a affinity for the Irish because I'm Irish, and I grew up that way. My parents are both Notre Dame fans, as well as Clemson fans, obviously. But so yeah, I'd say probably Notre Dame would be the only team that I can really show a mutual respect for, or maybe root for if they're not playing against Clemson.
Absolutely. So my next question to you is, we're going to flip the coin here. What would you say, and you might have a definitive answer for this, which team do you hate the most?
Well, it's South Carolina. It's not close because I grew up in South Carolina, and people outside of the state don't really understand it. And part of that has to do with the fact that South Carolina has been pretty much irrelevant in football for the majority of their existence. And so people don't take it seriously. But in this state, everybody takes it seriously. I have a lot of friends that are Gamecocks. There's more Gamecock fans in the state of South Carolina or in general than there are Clemson fans, just because they are a much larger school. Clemson's only about 25, 27, somewhere around there, 1,000 undergrad. And South Carolina is basically double that. So they're a much larger university with a much larger following. But yeah, the hate between these two schools and fan bases is right up there with the best of them in the country. Even the Alabamas and Auburns, even the Ohio States and Michigans. People don't realize that, but it's true. So South Carolina, close second, Ohio State.
Yeah, for sure. So let's see. You talked about your story about how much you hate South Carolina, and not that I can't disagree with that, considering what they did to my team last week. Ugh. But anyway, what would you say, going back to Clemson, what would you say is probably the greatest moment you've gotten to experience as a Clemson fan?
That's a great question. And it's recent too. Okay, the 2016 national championship when Deshaun Watson threw that pass to Hunter Renfrow at the very last seconds of the game to win, beat Alabama, Clemson's first national championship since 1981, and that's the key here, because I've been alive technically for all three of Clemson's titles, but I was 1 year old when they won in 1981, so clearly I don't remember that. So basically, my entire young childhood, Clemson was like, during the 80s, Clemson was a top 5, top 10 program. They were a pretty dominant team. 90s, things started to flatten out and fizzle off, and they went through a rough period for about 20 years. So for those 20 years, it was pretty rough. So when things started to take a turn, when Dabo took over, and it took him 3 or 4 years to get things rolling, and you could just see the progression year after year after year with the recruiting and the results on the field, and you knew something special was about to happen. So when they won in 2016. Obviously, I was an adult at the time. I was 36 years old. It's the first time in my life. I didn't even ever imagine that I was going to see that happen. Like the previous 20 years before that, I was jaded. I thought this was the Clemson's destiny was just to be an 8-4 team every year on average and make a decent bowl, and hopefully they can win it. So when that happened, that was probably the greatest moment I've ever experienced in sports. I'll never forget it. I was in the living room. My wife was in the bedroom when that play happened. She came right out of the bedroom and tackled me onto the floor. And I don't think I slept for 48 hours after that. Rewatched the game 10 times. So by a long shot, that night was the greatest thing I've ever experienced as a fan.
Definitely. If I was in your position, I definitely wouldn't have slept either. That's a sure fact. Now, of course, I hate to flip the coin once again here, but I do have to ask, what is probably the worst moment for you as a Clemson fan?
Oh, so many.
Oh boy.
The 2013 beatdown that we took at the hands of Florida State in Clemson, which I believe, no, that's not right. It's one of the last games we lost at home. We lost to Pitt in 2016. That's the last time we lost at home. But yeah, by a long shot. Well, not by a long shot. There's so many. That one sticks out to me. This isn't a moment, but it's a period of time that was really rough when we lost to our in-state rival, South Carolina, 5 years in a row, when Steve Spurrier was there. That was rough because it was a weird time where the program was gaining momentum and getting better every year and starting to experience things like conference titles that they hadn't had in a long time. But they couldn't beat South Carolina. That was rough. And that almost led Dabo Swinney being fired. Thank God that Terry Don Phillips, who was the athletic director at Clemson at that time, didn't fold under pressure, because there was a lot of pressure from the fan base, and I'm assuming probably a lot of pressure from some of the boosters as well, that if you lose to South Carolina 5 years in a row, then you aren't the coach at Clemson, period. He saw the forest for the trees and saw something in Dabo and kept him on, and the rest is history. So that was a pretty rough period of time, but thank God, like I said, thank God that we had the athletic director that saw the bigger picture and not just what was happening against South Carolina.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really smart athletic director right there. We would have fired him already.
Right.
So this is probably an obvious question here, considering how well Clemson's done, but are you satisfied with the current state of your football team?
Yes. Obviously, I have my gripes like everybody else. There's not a single fan base out there that doesn't have some sort of gripe with their team or the way it's run or their program. But going back to what I was saying earlier about the 20 years, the majority, half of my life or more of the mediocrity that was happening at Clemson, I'm extremely thankful to have experienced what I've experienced over the past 10 years. Because, there's just certain teams, like it's like I said yesterday on a video that I did. Like, what if I grew up in Iowa by happenstance and I ended up being an Iowa State fan? Iowa State's never accomplished anything in football. They're, I think, statistically like the worst program in the Power Five as far as their accomplishments go. So I feel extremely lucky. I didn't choose Clemson. It kind of chose me. So I don't have anything to do with it. But, yeah.
Just think you could have been a Kansas fan. Yeah.
That's right.
So my next question to you is, as being a college football fan for as long as you have and seeing how everything's played out and going through all these years of hardships and happiness, what do you personally get out of being a college football fan?
A lot of pain and misery and suffering. Yeah, I don't know. That's a tough question. Well, one thing I could tell you is that I've made a lot of really good lifelong friends through the sport, and I've had a lot of great times, great nights. I had a lot of down nights. So it's a blessing and a curse to be a hardcore sports fan, isn't it? Because it costs money to be a fan. Unless you just never go to a game or never buy a piece of apparel. So it costs money. It costs time. And depending on how big of a fan you are, it costs yourself some kind of mental or emotional anguish from time to time. But all in all, I love it. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Some of my best memories in my life revolve around the sport. Even though I didn't play it. Not at a college level.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you said about making friends in this community, that actually ties into my next question. Being a part of this college football community, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the YouTube community. It can be like the national scale. But if you want to just stick with the YouTube community, that's fine too. But what do you think with all the things we've done in this community, all the friends we've made? What about it do you think attracts so many people? What do you think is so special about this college football community?
Well, it's a niche community as far as YouTube is concerned. I mean, there's much other bigger genres out there that exist. I don't know what I think that we all have something in common. We're all crazy in our own way, irrational when it comes to sports, super fans, as you will, because, college football has got the shortest season in major sports. It's only 4 months long. And so 8 months out of the year, there's no games to be played. But in this community, these people show up year round, not just during the season. And so I think that alone makes this community special. And the fact that we can all, well, not all. I mean, look, there's some things that happen on here that are not good. We've all seen it, but that's going to be expected. But for the most part, we can all joke with each other and crack on each other, and nobody's feelings really get hurt. Sometimes things get a little bit personal, and they shouldn't. But again, like I said, that's kind of the natural thing when especially with the internet. But it's a pretty close-knit group of people. I mean, even the people, like, for instance, me and you, like, I've known of you a long time. You've known of me a long time. We haven't really had a lot of conversations, but I still consider, but Squidtard is still like a prominent member in the community in my mind. You know what I mean? And that's the way it is. Whether you're a content creator or just a viewer or subscriber, everybody contributes to the greater cause.
Absolutely. Could not have said that any better than you did.